Chapter 32. The Ploughman's Arms. Once they had finished with dinner, Reyes and Gaggara continued to head south, their eyesight enhanced through the use of magic. They flew pretty much in silence at first, the cold night air playing on their senses. This was a strange country to both of them. Reyes had never travelled much farther south than Lamington before, and for Gaggara, everything was new. "Are we travelling much further?" Gaggara called to her boyfriend after they'd been in the air for a little while. "I want to get far enough ahead to the elves so that when we wake up in the morning we still have a decent start on them," Reyes called back. Lamais was a fairly large dukedom in terms of square miles. It was almost the same size as Carlis, but Lamais was a long, thin dukedom. It took the two harpies less than 3 hours to fly south across the narrow dukedom and then to Bourton. Reyes didn't really notice when he had crossed the border, but the mostly open ground of Lamais once again gave way to luscious green forests. "Is it much further?" Gaggara shouted to him. "I think we can probably stop soon," Reyes replied. "No," Gaggara called back. "I'm into the capital." "Oh, we're about halfway," Reyes informed her. Bourton was easily as big as the Moth, Carlis and Lamais put together. "Only halfway?" Gaggara called to him, glancing back over her shoulder for an instant, as if trying to gauge just how far they had come. "I think we have a decent head start on the Elven army," Reyes called back. "Let's find somewhere suitable to stop for the night." "Sounds good to me," Gaggara replied. She flew a little lower, almost brushing the top branches of the trees. "I'll start looking for a decent clearing." "Don't," Reyes instructed. "It'd be better if you got a little practice mingling with humans. I'm going to look for an inn." "An inn?" Gaggara called back worriedly. "But there'll be people there. People you don't know." "Exactly," Reyes called to her. "It'll be good practice for when we reach the capital. The streets will be swarming with people neither of us knows. Visiting an inn will help us settle in slowly." "I don't like it," Gaggara intoned. "It sounds like we're asking for trouble." The King's Eastern Highway was one of the 3 most heavily travelled roads in the kingdom. It was a major lifeline in and out of First Town, and the majority of the major cities of the country could be found somewhere along its path. As a result, a traveller wouldn't have to travel far before they found themselves walking past an inn of some description. Reyes and Gaggara weren't travelling along the road, so when they flew over the old ramshackle building that looked more like a barn than an inn, Reyes almost ignored it. There was a man standing out in the open just behind the inn. He was a chubby man, and was wearing an apron, which might have been what made Reyes think he'd found an inn. The chubby man was sprinkling feed to the chickens he kept back there, and by the sound of it, clucking to them as he did so. Reyes didn't really notice the man until he was passing overhead. Then the man, evidently realising there was something above him, looked up, and for a second he stared Reyes right in the eye. There seemed to be a second's hesitation, as if the chubby man couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he threw the remainder of the seeds into the air and fled for the perceived safety of the inn. Reyes flew just beyond the inn and landed in an open field. Gaggara landed beside him a moment later. Reyes would have to admit he was feeling quite tired, despite the breaks they had taken along the way. He was looking forward to spending the night in a relatively comfortable bed. All manner of noises seemed to be coming from the inn. There was a lot of shouting, muffled by the wooden walls of the inn, and the sound of something large and heavy being scraped across the floor of the inn to block the door. "Now what?" Gaggara asked, her expression filled with worry. Reyes handed Agnar's ring to Gaggara and said, "Now we go in." Gaggara took the ring. She played with it for a moment, and then she placed it on her finger. Her body went through its magical change. She gave Reyes an uncertain smile and asked, "How do I look?" "Human," Reyes replied. Gaggara commented unhappily. Reyes then altered his own appearance so that he too looked human. Then he put on the clothing that Mangloss had supplied for him, feeling a little bit overdressed once he was wearing them. Reyes wasn't finished. He stepped gently behind Gaggara and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. A second later, she was dressed in the clothing they had procured from Alicia. Gaggara commented. "Clothing. I don't think I'll ever get used to the idea." "Sorry, love," Reyes replied. "But you can't walk into the barroom of an inn naked." "Humans and their nudity taboos," Gaggara commented. "Still, if I was stuck in a body as ugly as a human's, I'd want to cover it too." Reyes laughed. He placed a hand on her upper arm and stroked gently. "This body makes me feel weird," Gaggara commented. "It feels so wrong. I hate the fact that I can't feel my wings or my tail. My feet feel awkward. It's almost like I know I'll fall over if I try to walk." Reyes nodded. "I know what you mean. I feel much the same," He admired her for a second. Despite all her complaining, Gaggara seemed to have taken the transformation well. He remembered the first time he had been transformed from human to harpy. He had hardly been able to speak. "Well," she said. She glanced at her boyfriend as if hoping he would change his mind. "I guess we'd better get on with it." Reyes nodded. "I hate to tell you to stay quiet, my love. However, the people here are not likely to take kindly to someone speaking anything except flourish. By all means, feel free to listen in on the conversation, but don't join in. Not unless it's really important." "Whatever you say, handsome." Gaggara looked at him with an expression of distaste on her face. She didn't like his human body. Nevertheless, she took hold of his arm, and together the two of them walked slowly towards the inn. It wasn't a long walk from where the two had landed to the inn's front door, but it was further than Gaggara would usually like to walk. Like any harpy, she preferred to be in the air, and she rarely liked to walk unless the situation absolutely demanded it. "This body is so limited," she complained. Reyes tried the main entryway of the inn, and wasn't all that surprised when he found that it was locked. He knocked loudly on the door 3 times in quick succession and shouted, "Hello? Are you not open?" For a moment there was silence. Then an argument broke out between a man and a woman. Their voices were a little muffled by the wooden walls, but Reyes was so close to the inn now that he was able to make out most of what was being said. "I tell you, I saw a harpy fly overhead. She was so close I could have reached up and touched her," the man was shouting. "Don't be silly. Harpies don't fly this far south. It's why we moved here in the first place. I saw what I saw." "Okay, assuming you weren't hallucinating, and you really did see a harpy, do you seriously think that she would bother to knock before asking to come in?" "Aye." "And are you really willing to leave a customer out there in the open, where a harpy might get them?" "But go and let our customers in." Then there was silence. Reyes glanced questioningly at Gaggara, and she smiled back, a glint in her eye. After what seemed to be several minutes, Reyes saw the chubby face of the innkeeper peering out at him through one of the inn's small square windows. The innkeeper's face didn't stay there for long. It disappeared again after only a second or two. Almost immediately upon the face disappearing from the window came the distinctive sound of a large and heavy object now being moved away from the other side of the door. A few seconds after that came the sound of a bolt being thrown back, and then the door was opened. The innkeeper stood before them. He looked very nervous and sounded quite jittery as he addressed them. "Welcome to the Ploughman Arms." Although he spoke to Reyes and Gaggara, he seemed almost to be ignoring them, looking beyond where they stood, trying to watch the trees that lined the edge of the property. "Are you all right?" Reyes asked, sounding genuinely concerned. He even glanced over his shoulder as if trying to find what the innkeeper was looking at. I'm not sure," the innkeeper replied. His voice was shaky, and he seemed to be having trouble speaking. He swallowed deeply and then said, "I thought I saw a harpy fly overhead. You didn't happen to notice it, did you?" Gaggara started to giggle. The innkeeper gave her a funny look and then looked questioningly at Reyes. Reyes nudged Gaggara gently with his elbow in an attempt to quiet her. "Sorry, we saw nothing of the sort." Gaggara's giggle became more of a laugh. She looked apologetically up at Reyes and then glanced at the innkeeper. "Can we come in?" Reyes asked. The innkeeper gave Gaggara another strange look, and then seemed to dawn on him that he was blocking the doorway. He took a step back, making enough room for his 2 new visitors to enter the inn. Gaggara couldn't stop laughing as she entered the inn. Reyes assumed that it had to be something to do with how nervous she was in this situation. The innkeeper, asking them both whether or not they'd seen any harpies, had hardly helped. Even after Reyes and Gaggara had entered the inn, the innkeeper didn't close the door immediately. Instead, he stepped back into the opening and seemed to be examining the surrounding countryside, still looking for his elusive harpies. From above, Reyes had thought that this building looked very much like an old barn. Now that he was inside the building, he saw very little to dissuade that thought. The walls of the inn were made from thin planks of wood that had been loosely nailed together. There were several gaps between some of the planks, and some of the gaps were clearly large enough to let the wind through. Reyes could easily imagine how this barn would whistle on a windy day. Over the years, the inn had seen a fair amount of repair work. Several extra planks had been added haphazardly to help hold the walls together. In some places, nails, now rusted with age, hadn't been hammered in properly, or they had been bent out of shape, and had been left sticking partially out of the wood rather than removed. The innkeeper and his family had done their best to turn these into features, hanging various decorations to brighten the place up and to hide some of the worst blemishes. The main barroom of the inn was actually quite small. There were only 5 tables scattered around the barroom. On each table was a small, flickering candle, providing what little light they could. Each table also had 4 chairs. Every chair in the room seemed to have been made locally and cheaply. No 2 chairs were exactly alike. What was more, some of the chairs looked so old and rickety that Reyes doubted they could hold the weight of a small child, let alone a fully grown adult. The bar itself stretched for about half the length of the wall furthest from the entryway. Like the rest of the inn, the bar had been made from cheap planks of wood, but whoever had built the bar had done a very good job of it. 2 oil lamps sat on the counter at either end, helping to illuminate the workspace. Sitting on the single shelf behind the bar was a row of 3 small barrels, each of them clearly labelled as containing a different beverage. Also, behind the bar was another doorway. This one led into another part of the inn, and through which Reyes could smell the unmistakable scent of chicken being roasted. "I'm hungry," Gaggara confided, trying to keep her voice low so she wasn't overheard. Evidently, she could smell the chicken too. "Me too," Reyes told her. There were also a few others in the inn. A couple of men were sitting at a table in a corner of the barroom drinking the night away. When Reyes and Gaggara entered the room, the 2 paused in their conversation and seemed to be paying the newcomers special attention. Gaggara grasped Reyes' arm tightly, holding him for moral support. The 2 patrons seemed to be friendly enough, though. One even inclined his head slightly by way of greeting, before looking back towards his partner, with an eye to continuing this conversation. Elsewhere in the barroom, standing behind the bar, there was also a chubby woman. Reyes assumed that had to be the innkeeper's wife. The woman was busy filling a couple of tankards from one of the barrels. Standing not too far from her was a young boy. Reyes estimated that the boy could be no older than 14. The boy was resting with his back against the wall, and a very bored expression on his face. Reyes and Gaggara moved slowly towards the nearest table. Before he risked sitting down, he tested the strength of the chair with his hand. The chair looked as if it was about to collapse under its own weight, but it seemed to take the pressure of his hand fairly comfortably. Reyes closed his eyes as he sat on the chair, expecting the whole thing to collapse under him. Gaggara's attitude to the flimsy-looking chairs was slightly different. She didn't seem to worry whether or not a chair would take her weight. What she did seem to have on her mind was that the design of the chair wasn't conducive to her wings and tail, even though she had neither at the moment. She reversed the chair so that its back was resting against the table before she sat on it. "I've never been in an inn before," Gaggara commented, looking around the room, her eyes wide with wonder. "Shh," Reyes told her. "Remember what I told you." Reyes turned his attention to the innkeeper's wife. She emerged from behind the bar, carrying the 2 tankards that she had just poured over to the bar's other patrons. She then sloshed them down on the table, heedless of how much was lost. Once she delivered the drinks, she approached the table where Reyes and Gaggara sat. At first, Reyes assumed that she was going to ask the pair of them what they wanted to drink. Instead, she addressed her husband. "So, which of these 2 is your harpy?" Gaggara started to giggle again. She tucked her head in her hands. The inn's other 2 patrons also began to laugh. Reyes began to feel very nervous. He looked up at the woman, then he looked across at the innkeeper, and finally back to the woman. "Shut up, woman," the innkeeper ordered. "I know what I saw." He stepped out from behind the bar again. He had a pair of tankards in his hands, and these he set down on the table in front of Reyes and Gaggara. "Your first drink is on the house, sir, ma'am. Think of it as an apology for closing the door on you. Can I get you anything else?" "What do you have that's cooked, or nearly cooked?" Reyes asked. He looked at Gaggara and smiled. "I smell chicken. Do you have any chicken ready to serve? We've been on the road all day and we're starving." "We do have some chicken left," the innkeeper agreed. "Bring us all you have," Reyes instructed. "Also any pork, beef, lamb, or whatever other meat you might have that's ready for serving. Bring it all out together, a plate for each of us." "Well, we don't have a lot cooking, sir. As you can see, we aren't all that busy tonight, but I'll see what I can rustle up for you. What would you like in the way of vegetables?" "No vegetables," Reyes replied genially. "We harpies are carnivorous, you know." Gaggara started to giggle again. There was more laughter from the other 2 patrons. "Seriously though," Reyes added quickly, "just the meat." "It'll be right up, sir," the innkeeper said, slightly irritated. He returned to the bar. His wife tutted loudly and then followed him with an amused smirk on her face. Reyes examined the pint of beer before him. This wouldn't be the first time he had touched alcohol, but it was the first time he had seen things appear to be floating on the surface of his pint. He fished some of it out with his thumb and forefinger and examined it in the light of the candle. It was quite innocuous. It was a hop that had been left out of the fermenting process. Reyes determined that it was harmless and took a sip from the liquid. It was foul and weak, but it was wet, and he was thirsty. Before he knew it, he had drained the tankard to the bottom. "I don't like it," Gaggara commented. Perhaps she spoke a little louder than Reyes would have liked, but no one seemed to have noticed she wasn't speaking flourish. She put the tankard of her beer back down on the table with a look of disgust on her face. Reyes looked over at the bar. "Do you have any water? My wife isn't keen on the beer." "Wife?" Gaggara repeated, shocked. "Coming right up," the innkeeper's wife replied. "Fresh water from our very own village well." "Wife," Gaggara pressed, keeping her voice low, "if someone notices that you're pregnant, it'll look better if they think we're already married," Reyes whispered back. "And besides, I'm sure you don't want separate rooms." It took only a couple of minutes for the woman to arrive with a tankard of fairly fresh water. She placed it in front of Gaggara and took the beer. Gaggara drained the tankard of water quickly and put the tankard back down on the table. "I'll have that," Reyes commented, indicating the second beer, rather than waste it. The woman placed the tankard back on the table, this time in front of Reyes. Then she said, "Are you two really married? You seem so young. I doubt you're much older than my son." Reyes looked at Gaggara and then winked at her. When he looked up at the woman and answered, "We married about 2 months ago. It was a simple ceremony." The woman gave Reyes a confiding smile, and then turned to Gaggara. "You're a very lucky woman." "I know," Gaggara replied. She quickly put her hand over her mouth, shocked at what she had said. The woman smiled again. It didn't seem to register with her that Gaggara hadn't spoken flourish. Reyes assumed that it had to be because she understood the meaning behind the words, thanks to Manglos's medallion, and hadn't thought twice about it. "I keep telling my son that it's time he found someone, but he isn't interested," the woman commented. She looked wistful. "He just likes to spend his days with his friends." Then she suddenly changed the subject. "I can tell by your accent that you don't come from around here." "Them off," Reyes said quickly. Reyes was beginning to wish she would leave them alone. Maybe she ought to be in the kitchens, preparing their food for them. "Oh, them off," the woman commented. "Such a beautiful country." "That's a long way to come by foot, though." She looked at him appraisingly. "Or do you have a horse or two?" "We came under our own power," Reyes agreed. "Yeah," called one of the other patrons. "They flew." There was more laughter. Most of it came from the 2 other patrons, but this time Reyes felt obliged to join in. Gaggara also couldn't help giggling. "Them off," the woman said dreamily. "You're so lucky to live there. It's such a lovely part of the world. I'm sure you know that the heir to the throne recently married a young girl from your neck of the woods. She's quite a beauty, or so they say. It's just a shame that the mob sits right on the border with those insidious elves." "Elves," Reyes commented, nodding his head. Part of him wanted to warn her about the fast approaching elven army. At the rate they were travelling, they would reach here sometime tomorrow, possibly as early as lunchtime. "Yes, about the elves." The woman, though, clearly had other things on her mind. She had been deliberately manipulating the conversation, leading it in a certain direction, and she wasn't about to be distracted now. "My son speaks a little Elvish, you know." "Really?" Reyes stated, glancing at the bored-looking boy sitting behind the bar. "How did he learn that?" The woman smiled and looked around at her son. "We used to live in Ganespa. It too was a lovely country. The Duke wanted some of his subjects to learn the Elvish, Goblin and Harpy languages. My son was one of those chosen to learn Elvish." "Why?" Reyes asked. "I was never clear on that. I guess the Duke didn't feel it necessary to confide all his plans to his subjects." "I guess not," Reyes agreed. "I remember how proud we all were when my son was one of those chosen. I can't tell you how proud I was." Then she began to cry. "Are you all right?" Reyes asked. "I'll be fine," she replied, sniffling. "Thinking back to our days in Ganespa, it brings back sad memories, that's all." "I'm sorry," Reyes said. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really," the woman replied. Reyes decided not to press the issue. "It happened some time after," the woman said, regardless. "Now, Harpies had always been in the habit of buzzing our farm and stealing our livestock. It was a hard life on the farm, but we were just able to survive thanks to help from the Duke." Gaggara seemed to be finding something interesting to look at across the other side of the room. Then, one awful day, Harpies attacked our farm again. The tears started to get the better of her. She sobbed. "My lovely daughter." "I'm sorry," Reyes comforted. He felt he could guess the rest. "It's why we moved here," the woman said. She brightened up a little. My son speaks fluent Elvish, although there isn't a lot of call for it around here. Race looked hopefully towards the kitchens again. The food seemed to be taking forever to be ready. I fear you may find more use for him soon. Look, I should warn you about the elves. Oh, we never see elves in these parts, the woman commented. She looked at her son and called him over. Samper, why don't you come over here and say something in Elvish to this young couple? Mother, Samper complained. Well, the woman insisted. Come on. The boy stepped out from behind the bar. There was a look of resigned irritation on his face. He approached the table where Reyes and Gaggara were standing, and then looked challengingly at his mother. What? Speak some Elvish to these good people, she replied. Alistran, mother, Samper replied. There are 4 different elven languages. Yes, dear, the mother cooed. Now, do as your mother tells you, and speak some Elvish to these 2. The boy sighed, and then he said to Reyes, You know, sometimes I really hate her. She treats me like some sort of circus freak, having me display my ability with languages to anyone that happens to pass by. Reyes smiled at the boy, and then glanced up at the woman, and said, He's good. Fluent, the mother agreed, beaming. The boy shook his head sadly, and looking at Reyes said, How would you know that was even Alistran? I could have been talking in total gibberish, and I doubt you would know the difference. Oh, I'd know, Reyes told the boy calmly. You speak Elvish too? The woman seemed amazed. For a moment, Samper also seemed quite astonished. But then he implored Reyes, Please don't tell my mother what I just said about her. I don't want her upset. I won't, Reyes agreed. Your wife seems very quiet, the woman said. I've hardly heard a peep out of her all night. Is she all right? I'm sure she's fine, Reyes replied. He offered Gaggara another smile. She's just a little shy. Shy? Gaggara blurted out. That wasn't Alistran, mother, Samper commented. Reyes felt his entire body suddenly tighten. Don't be silly, dear, the woman replied. It was Flourish. It wasn't Flourish either, mother, Samper offered. It was, the innkeeper's wife insisted. I understood her perfectly. Now, return to your post. Reyes relaxed again as the boy returned to his spot behind the bar. I should get back to the bar myself, the woman commented. If you could see what's happened to our food, I'd be very grateful, Reyes told her. The woman glanced round at the doorway leading into the kitchens. It shouldn't be too long. My husband is seeing to it. Then, wiping the last vestiges of a tear from her eyes, she left the 2 harpies to themselves. It wasn't too much of a wait before the food was brought out to them. It was heaped high and fairly evenly on a pair of plates. Each plate held a quarter of a chicken, a good few thick slices of ham, and a whole beef steak. Are you sure you can manage all this? The innkeeper asked as he placed the plates on the table. Not a problem, Reyes replied. He picked up the beef steak in his bare hands and began to devour it. It was hard to believe he could be as hungry as he was. It took him less than a minute to eat his way through the steak, and to get to the chicken. Gaggara was also tearing into the food on her plate of meat with relish. She was throwing the chicken bones over her shoulder where they landed on the sawdust-covered floor. Having delivered the food, the innkeeper retired to the bar to fetch fresh drinks for Reyes and Gaggara. He returned and placed the drinks down on the table. Then he began to hover close by. Can I help you? Reyes asked between mouthfuls. His plate was already beginning to look a little sparse. The innkeeper coughed politely. That'll be 4 crore, sir. Oh, right, Reyes replied. He put his hand in one of the pockets of his jacket and called forth the pouch of coins from the ring. He then took the pouch from his pocket as if that had been its resting place all along and set it lightly down on the table. Then he opened the pouch and blindly selected a single coin. It was a gold coin. I can't change that, sir, the innkeeper said hesitantly. The 2 patrons at the other table also seemed to have stopped their conversation and were looking open-mouthed at the coin. Reyes dropped the gold coin back into the pouch and pulled forth a silver coin to replace it with. This he handed to the innkeeper. The innkeeper stared at the coin in stunned bewilderment. I'm not even sure I can change this. Then don't worry about it, Reyes told him. He returned the pouch to his pocket and from there back to the ring. Perhaps you'll be kind enough to bring us some more meat if there's any available. We'll also need a room for the night. I assume you can find a room for the 2 of us? And it goes without saying we want breakfast before we leave tomorrow. Yes, the innkeeper agreed, still looking at the coin. That still won't use up all the coin. Then keep the rest as a bonus, Reyes commented. Maybe, when my wife and I are heading back home, we'll stop here again. So keep a room open for us just in case. That I will, the innkeeper agreed. That I will.